So, image of God. So the obvious place to start is going to be in Genesis 1, 26 to 28. I'm going to say right now that the most appropriate thing to do would be a full-blown expository study of Genesis 1, because this is like right at the tail end of it. We don't have time for that if we want to actually get to the point of image of God. So we're just I'm gonna give some brief comments, and if you want more explanation on that, I mean, obviously there's time for questions and everything. But we're gonna have to just kind of jump straight to day 6, halfway through day 6, just because everything else before has so much going on that if I were to spend time on that, we would never get to day 6, second half, until at the earliest next week, and even then, I would probably find a way to make it for another 3 weeks until we get there. Because Genesis 1 is just so richly beautiful, but because we come at it with a certain perspective and a certain lens or a certain argument in mind, we ignore so much of what's happening because we're very focused on the tail end of each day. We're not focused on the things that are happening in each day, which is, I find very heartbreaking, honestly, because it's disservice to the text. And I find it heartbreaking. There's so many arguments over a passage, over certain sentences, without taking into account the entirety of the passage. It's kind of like every major theological framework where we argue over certain passages, but we don't keep them in context, and then it's just we're so busy arguing that we ignore the passage itself. So the right thing to do would be a full-blown Genesis 1 study, but in order to actually focus on this particular study, we're not going to do that. God said, "Let us make mankind," or humankind, "in our image and according to our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of heaven, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every moving thing that moves upon the earth." So, this is a very, very loaded statement. There's a lot here, with a lot of assuming that you know what's going on, which is why we're going to try and break this down as simply as we can. So the word for humankind, interesting enough, is the word Adam. It's the same exact word used for Adam in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3, and everywhere else that Adam appears. Because Adam/Adam means humankind, mankind. If it's used in the plural, it's often in reference to the entirety of humanity. If it's used in the singular, it could be referring to a specific person, usually Adam, or just man in general. There are other words for man. We see that with male and female, he created them. Those are different words there. But the word there is Adam. And then you get to Genesis 2, where it's used as a proper name. He makes Adam, or he makes Adam. He's not talking about humankind in the plural sense. He's not talking about Adam specifically. But we're still in Genesis 1. And so we see it says, "in our image, according to our likeness." The word for image in Hebrew, which makes sense to start there since it is the topic of focus, or the word of focus, is tselem. Refers to a statue, inscribed column, idol, image, replica, and can be a synonym for likeness. Can be. So that's very different than I think many of the immediate ideas people kind of throw around, where they say, oh, it's our cognitive abilities. Well, the word image literally means idol. We can trace this throughout the Bible. It's not even just like looking at a lexicon. You can open up a word study in like Logos or a Blue Letter Bible and click the word, click the Hebrew, and do a word study, and you see it can be translated as image or translated as idol. It's a variety of other things. So why idol? Genesis 1 depicts, in short, a temple construction, a cosmic temple construction. We see this because the structure of each day and the order of which those days take place is mimicked in the Exodus tabernacle narrative. There are 7 the Lord said statements in Exodus as well. The 7th one deals with Sabbath. Then in Moses' response, there are 6 times where it says Moses did as the Lord said, and the 7th one dealt with Sabbath. Well, in the Genesis 1 narrative, you have 6 creation steps, and God said, with the 7th being a Sabbath set. And then you have in Solomon's construction of the temple, he makes 6 proclamations, with the 7th being about Sabbath. This is not coincidental. It's not like, oh, look, this just happens to be 7. No, it's you see in the later biblical authors that they very much viewed the creation as a whole as what it was intended to be was almost like God's cosmic temple. He calls the earth, the Eretz, his footstool, and the heavens, or the Shamayim, his throne. So he sits over creation as if it's all his. I mean, it is all his, but he sits on it as if it's like his temple. Eden depicts a very similar thing, which we'll talk about later, where it also depicts a temple, or a temple depicts Eden. Well, what do you put in the middle of a temple? You put idols in the middle of the temple, or icons. The tabernacle still kind of does this in the sense where they have the Ark of the Covenant. They have that as like one of the centerpieces. But it's not an idol in the idea that we tend to bring the connotation to idol. It's like there's this thing here that's supposed to represent something about God, but it's not him. It's not supposed to be an idol of him, but it has this representation of his presence and the things that are supposed to be taking place within the Israeli, Hebrew-Israeli culture and religious practice. So still, the question comes down to why an idol? Well, if we look at our next little point here, this comes from the Lexham Theological Word Book. So they say tselem refers generally to something that is a likeness or representation resembling something or someone. The word tselem is used to describe mankind being created in the image of God and describe as Adam passing on his likeness to his son Seth. Outside of Genesis, however, a tselem is generally a religious object, including idols and animal figurines. In Ezekiel's depiction of Israel's idolatry as adultery, the references to images blur the lines between sexuality and idolatry. So they even tie this idea of idols with our practices as well. If I were to read from the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, which is one of the standards to use, it says it's a statue of a god, of a king. It's in general a figurine, and this can be metaphorical in some places, but it's also a constellation, shape, likeness, representation, idol, images, figures to represent replicas or likenesses, and it's a transitory image, so it's temporary. So I provide below a graph of all the places and all the ways that tselem can be used. The bottom one, the one on there, follows the ESV, and that is tracking every single word for image to show that tselem is not the only word that we translate as image, but it is the root word for some of these words. And then if you look on the one above, that is every reference of tselem through a pie chart. So it's used a lot. Genesis is used the most for tselem because they sometimes use other words for images and idols. Usually they also will use a word that is engraven image or metal casting. And tselem would not fit that word just due to the roots in the Hebrew. They need to use a different set of root words to get those. The word that they're referring to, like engraven images, metal, that's melted. It's kind of like some words in our own language where we use a similar word, but we have to use a different root word for it because of just the nature of the definitions. So let's talk about what the purpose of an image or an idol was in the ancient Near East. We kind of touched on it a little bit. I also provide every reference for you if you want to go check those out in the notes. What I will say is that the earlier ones, they tend to focus on image of God and the idea of God creating humanity. And then the later ones, they're using it more the negative connotation of statues of kings, statues of other gods and idols that they worship. To quote from the Zondervan Illustrative Background Bible Commentary, which is a great resource with a very long name for no good reason, other than they had to sneak their name in there somewhere. Throughout the ancient Near East, an image was believed to contain the essence of that which it represented. That essence equipped the image to carry out its function. In Egyptian literature, there is one occurrence of people in general having been created in the image of deity in the destruction of the Merkare, dated to about 2000 BC. But it is generally the king who is spoken of in such terms. The image is the source of his power and prerogative, In Mesopotamia, there are three categories of significance. One, as in Egypt, the king is occasionally described as being in the image of deity. Two, an idol contained the image of the deity. And three, the image of a king was present in monuments set up in territories that he had conquered. And this is actually even evident in passages like in 2 Kings, Chronicles, and some of the prophets, where they refer to a king who builds a statue, and it's this thing that does one of the three things that are there, if not all three. But I think the interesting thing is that in Egyptian is not the only who thought this. They very much believed that only the pharaohs or the kings were in God's image. Every other human was not. So it's only like the elites that were image bearers of God, which is why you would have some of those religions where they acted as if they were God, because they believed that when they died, they would become like one of the gods or one of the gods, because they were in his image, or his images. That is not really on track with what we're talking about.
Depictions of the gods in Egypt, though.
They're still not in line with the theology that they have. Nephilim does not really play into this theology of how they viewed image of God. Because yes, you had some mighty warriors and kings who were Nephilim, but like the Pharaoh of Joseph, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, as far as we know, there was nothing related to him about being a Nephilim. But it was their theology that a Pharaoh was in the image of God, that he would be like God, and we'll talk more about that in a second. So for a lot of these other cultures, an idol had a royal and a religious connection, which was very much intertwined. And so we already have to throw away the idea that the image is strictly cognitive abilities or spiritual aspects. I think that is, with the right intention of trying to get on track, to just strictly say that's the image is to neglect the exact wording and neglect the exact purpose of what humanity is. Because the image plays more into a mixture of, as John Kilner puts it, which he argues very, very deeply in his book here, that the image ties into the dignity and the destiny of humanity, which is why he called his book Dignity and Destiny. Because it deals with the value of who humanity is and the purpose that humanity has. And to strictly say that it is our cognitive abilities, well, the language doesn't allow that. But to say it's also strictly just our bodies neglects the entirety of our spiritual aspects. And so we tend to get into this conversation of, okay, the whole idea of like, are we trichotomists, dichotomists? I'm going to say that at least for the Hebrew authors, humanity was unichotomist in a sense, that you can't be human without the entirety of being in flesh and having the ruach, having this breath in you. That is, you cannot be human if you are a ruach. If you are ruach, you are not an image bearer. You are not in the image of God. So therefore, spiritual beings are not created as images, because the word necessitates that the person is spirit and flesh. Which is why we're going to get to this much later. I'll give a little spoiler. Jesus is interesting. He is called the image. We have a preposition. We have in before. We're in the image. He is the image. But he's not the image because he's God. In fact, Philippians makes it very clear that he had to take on the likeness of humanity. And they're using the same language. They're using icon, which is the Greek equivalent for tselem. He is the image, first off, because he is human. That is a big deal of the fact that he became down in flesh. And that's part of the reason why so much of the language Paul uses is referring to how we are being conformed to his image. Well, it's not that, hey, we're going to be conformed later when we're in heaven. It's like, no, you're being conformed now. Who you are now, what you are now, is deeply tied to the image forever. And that is why we need to really just throw out the whole argument that the Christian purpose is that we die someday and go to heaven, and that's it. That is the exact opposite of what the Bible teaches. It does not teach that as the end. It puts a great deal of emphasis on how the physical and the spiritual are supposed to be one together, and that humanity is supposed to be a physical being that has this spiritual connection to the Lord. To have one without the other is not to have humanity. And so to say that the image is these cognitive abilities, while I appreciate the effort to try and show some distinctions between us and animals, it falls far too short just due to the fact that the word doesn't say that. But it does tie in to that a little bit. But to strictly say it's all these metaphysical things, is far too short. It neglects at least half of what humanity is. It's a very loaded term because image alone refers to, as we've mentioned, idols. So if we're talking about a cosmic temple and we're the idols in there, and the idols have a purpose within the temple. So I'll kind of explain that briefly. So an idol's purpose, we kind of described this in the commentary, its purpose is to be a physical representation of the deity that they are worshiping. And so in some religions, it could be believed that the gods could come into the idol. It'd be like them coming and taking presence within the temple, within those idols. But it's not them. So to destroy the idol is not to destroy their gods. They would just build a new one. They weren't... I like how one comment, a scholar puts it, we kind of, just in general, we tend to treat the ancients like they're kind of stupid. Like, oh, they killed their statue, therefore we killed their god. No, they weren't idiots. They knew that that was not their god. It was a representation of their god. It had a purpose in their temple for worship. So that brings us to humanity. So if we have, let's just talk about how humanity is structured for a second. So humanity is described as Tselem. But we're also not a motionless, lifeless statue. We are moving, breathing. We can feel, we can engage in emotions and interactions. So already we have a very distinct difference between what humanity is supposed to be versus what their idols are supposed to be. And the other interesting thing too is we mentioned how kings were believed to be the only ones who are image, but yet right here in Genesis it says, no. Humankind, all of them, male and female, are both in God's image. Both are his image bearers. They are being his image. It is not just the elite. It's not just your kings. In fact, while Deuteronomy prepares Israel for a king, you can see in 1 Samuel that he's not in favor of there actually being a king. He's like, no, I'm your king, but you're rejecting me as your king. So that's not the ideal, but he, being God, already has a plan in place, which is why, when people say, oh, look, the Bible allows polygamy and all these things, see, all these kings had this. If you read Deuteronomy, they were not allowed to have multiple wives. They're not allowed to take up a whole lot of property. In fact, they're supposed to be very countercultural to the other kings of the area. So everything the other kings were doing, basically do the opposite. If they're taking over, don't, unless God tells you to. If they're accumulating all these riches, don't. If they're accumulating all of these other resources like animals and food, don't. If you're saying that you're the elite and everyone else is lesser than you, shut up, you are supposed to be serving them and protecting them. Stop being a moron, is basically. I find it funny sometimes that God often will be like, after someone does something like with Abraham, he's like, in short, we'll get to this with our next study, he's kind of in short like, stop it now. We have a covenant and you're not doing the thing that we said you're gonna do. Stop, you're being ridiculous. That's the Josh Davis translation. But so, kind of get into what humanity is, and we'll get into deeper definitions as we go. Humanity is created to be an idol of Yahweh, which means that just on what idols do, our role is to represent him in all that we do, because creation is his cosmic temple. This is his world. We're supposed to represent him as his images. But we're also, again, living and breathing. We'll get into this much, much later in further depth, but the very fact that we're living also entails another deep element into what it means to be an image. When we get to Genesis 5, I'll skip there now actually. What's interesting about Genesis 5 is that it's described that humanity is still in God's image or God's likeness. And then it says that Seth is in the likeness of Adam. It's the exact same language. So on one hand is showing, okay, so this image thing is not just Adam and Eve, it's every human being is passed on. But also it shows this deep relational connection of which the intention of humanity was that we were supposed to have this relation with the Lord. We have this relation with the Lord so we can engage in this relationship as sons and daughters of God. And then Carmen Imes and her efforts, and I think for the purpose of the analogy, I think it works. And she even admits it doesn't quite get it when you pull in all the New Testament theology, but like just to get the idea for a little bit, what is lost is the relationship with God, but the relation with God is not God. Not gone. And she likens it to a father and a son who are estranged from each other, where he is still genetically the father's creation, the father's offspring, but the relationship is gone. The relationship is not there, but they still have a relation in the fact that this is the father and this is the son. And this is interesting when you read the genealogies, sometimes they tie all the way back to God as the creator of Adam. So even then they're still showing, like the New Testament, this idea that we have this relation to God. But something's lost. Something is lost when we get to Genesis 3. Let's look at likeness, and then we'll move on to Genesis 3 a little bit. So likeness is demut, and so it refers to likeness that which has a similarity or comparison. Is an image what is seen, builder's craft or draft, sketch, a graphic representation, or building a construction. And so this is why you get some translations like the ISV, which is let us make mankind in our image to be like us. So they're trying to capture that relation aspect within there. They're with the word likeness, demut. And so the Hebrew Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament refers to it as a model or shape and likeness. And so some scholars say that likeness seems to refer to this could refer to the qualities in the idea that these are the tools that we use, and I'll admit that I mistakenly have stated this before. Likeness still is being used in the idea, it's kind of like almost like doubling down on the idea of image. Let us make man to be in our image. Not only, and he's going to be like us, meaning that he's not just going to be like a statue. He's going to be living. This is just showing the deep connection of the fact that humanity is meant to be a physical and spiritual thing intertwined. It cannot be merely just a body, because then we're lifeless, and it cannot be merely cognitive stuff, because now we're slipping into Gnosticism very quickly. In fact, it's funny to me how people, and I say this because I was one of these people, how if we just say the image is the stuff up here, we are dangerously close to slipping into Gnosticism. I'm not arguing for slippery slope fallacy. I'm arguing that it leaves the door open for us to slip there, because it leaves the door open to say that creation itself is not the intention, the full intention of God's purposes, which is problematic. But here's the thing. You do get a very drastic, very countercultural claim. First off, that not only is all humanity in the image of God, it specifies that male and female are both in his image. Both are in his image. So it's actually in the first page is making that very claim. The ideal and the purpose of humanity is that all of humanity, not just males, not just the elite, male and female, are both God's image and representation of God. And you get some very strong female figures in the Old Testament especially who sometimes represent God better than some of the males who are supposed to. Deborah is one of the big ones. Or, no, I can't remember her name, but there's one where this person, this ruler comes in and she takes a spike and and she's doing the very thing that no one else will do. She's like, kill him, and then she puts a spike through his head. And then you get Ruth, Esther. I mean, you get a lot of very strong female figures who do the very thing they're supposed to be doing. Rahav, yeah. And so I think even just with these terms, we can already see that the common, like I've listed out the questions below, but we kind of went there first. These common questions and assertions just need to be dispelled. They kind of just need to be pushed off. And then I have a whole list of scholars. I have 3 major quotes right here below that they get into more of an idea of understanding the image in regards to function, because they're focusing a lot on the word tselem. And I think that's a much better place to start. I do think we need to understand that function is not just a spiritual thing, it is a physical and spiritual thing together. And so they show that in their examples, but they don't always articulate that, which is something I wish they would do, because it can leave the door open to say, okay, so it's not the body, it's this. But if you keep reading, you see their examples, they're saying, well, when you work, when you do this, when you do that, well, those are all physical things that involve imaging him. But we have to understand that, even when I said, with the Shema in the class and in my sermon, that to love the Lord your God with all your levav, so inside, love him with all your nefesh, this thing right here, which is very much a physical thing, that already entails that to be truly human, to truly function as an image, to truly engage in that relationship and to do your purpose, it has to be the two together. And that's why I find it very unfortunate that we translate it as soul, because of the connotations we have implies the opposite. And again, I'm not arguing for slippery slope, but it leaves the door open for Gnosticism. Because, okay, so the body must clearly be bad. We can't love him with our body. Well, God says otherwise. And that's why for 2,000-ish years, we've rejected Gnosticism within the church. It's been rejected, but it's been slipping back in as very popular, whether we realize it or not. It's the argument is there, keeps the door open for it, and we need to understand that that door cannot be left open, because to argue that the intention of Christianity is to someday die and go to heaven, and that's the end, is the exact opposite of the teaching of the Bible. The exact opposite. That is a thing that will happen, but is not the end. So, I think it's interesting. I am skipping around a little bit. But I think it'd be good to go to Genesis 3 just for now. Maybe we can get into some questions. The rest of my commentary up to the second point, which is Tselem in the garden, which we'll go back to, because that just needs a whole nother day to focus on, because there's a lot of texts and diagrams to go through, which are very fascinating. I would never considered it and thought of it, and then mind blown when I read through the work. But I think it'd be good to go to Genesis 3 a little bit, just to kind of get rid of some of the other misconceptions of what the image is and isn't, or what was and wasn't lost. So why don't we go to Genesis 3. Again, it would be much more beneficial to do the entirety of Genesis 1 through 3 as an exposition. Don't have time for that. We are going to go a little more in depth to that when we do begin Chaos Monsters. So we're going to do a little more. We're going to spend a little more time in this, but I kind of just want to look at the question. One of the questions or statements he says: "You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree that is in the midst of the garden." So that's Eve's response to him. "But the serpent said to the woman, you will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Is this entire statement wrong? No, there's a lot of truth in this statement. Their eyes are opened. There is something that they did not have before that they then have. But this is another one that kind of throws the idea of the image of God is the intellectual capacities of humanity. Adam and Eve are already described within the Genesis 2 and Genesis 1 narrative as being images of God. They're already classified as an image. They're already in his likeness. So this thing that they don't have yet, first off, it's a lie to say that they aren't already like God, because they already were designed to be like God. At the same time, there are some things that God has not bestowed upon them yet, which shows that those things are not the image in and of itself. They're already his image. They're already his likeness. But there is something they still are waiting to be bestowed upon, but it's not that they're going to be an image later. They already are. So the serpent is playing this weird trick. We're saying, look, you think you're in his image, but you're not his image. Here's how you can become his image, but they're already his image. So this thing that they don't have is not what makes them the image, but is the lie that they believe that they are already not like God. But there are things that we are not like God in. First off, we don't have the same ontology as God. We are physical, he is not. There are some things that we just cannot fathom here. Let's just throw another thing out there. All humanity is in the image of God. So if we say it's intellectual capacities, we've just thrown everyone who has an intellectual or learning disability or has Down syndrome, saying that they are less like God. They're less in his image. And it's not because they sin, it's just because they're born that way. God allowed them to be born that way. Therefore, they're created not in his likeness, in his image. There is not a single passage that suggests the intellectual capacities are the thing that makes you like God. Not a single one. The serpent wants to play that trick on them because he's putting doubt in their minds that they are not in his likeness. We already know as readers that they are already declared as his likeness. Also, we'll get into this much further later, it's not their ability to discern morality because Eve is already discerning in the next few verses. So it's not talking about the fact that, you don't know what right and wrong is. It's assumed that they know because they're given the command. And she's discerning. She's contemplating. She's already processing things and deciding what is good and what's not good. She has the capacity to do that. So the tree is already much more different than we think it is. And we have to recognize that the image is not this, but it could be. But these are byproducts, but they're not it, because not everyone has the same intellect. Not everyone has the same capacities to do certain things. Not everyone has the same skill sets. Not everyone thinks or acts the same way. So we have to be very careful when we say it is this thing here, because especially when we consider that there are people who are just not able to do those things. And as Jesus says, you're not necessarily born with something because of sin. The person was born blind. He didn't sin. It was something his parents did that was wrong to cause him his blindness. He was just born blind. There are people who are born with Down syndrome. It's not necessarily because they sinned or because their parents sinned. It's just they're born that way, and they're there to glorify God. But they don't have the same way of thinking or processing. But if we throw that out there, it's very much leaves that door open to throw them out. Also, babies don't think and reason. And a lot of people want to use image of God as an argument for pro-life. They are in his likeness and his image from the second that they're created, second they are conceived. This is why it's such a short phrase, but it is so deeply thought about by Christians and debated among scholars and theologians because of the implications and all the wrong implications. There are people who have used image to justify slavery and racism and a variety of other things, where they're saying black people are not in the image of God. Clearly the white man is, and they would enslave people. We have issues where that's happened, and a variety of other things where we just misuse this term. And if we don't come at it with at least a right beginning point of understanding what it is, it tends to lead to a lot of destructive decisions made amongst humanity. Say, they're lesser. Especially those who are on the more extremist side, they will go full-blown into that. Hence enslavement and abuse of women, abuse of children, a variety of other things. All humanity is a very bold statement in the very first chapter. All humanity is in the likeness already. But Satan, or the serpent in this passage, is trying to say that you are not in his likeness. You are not. And the reason why is you don't have the full capacity of understanding like God does, which is the exact opposite of what God already stated about what humanity is. And so this is one, I'm going to be honest, this is one where I had to really wrestle with the entire time I was studying. I was just sitting there always thinking about the different implications. And so many of the arguments, I regrettably have made statements from up there about the image that I have drastically changed my opinion on. First one from a long time ago, before I went up there, is that the image of God is lost. Well, Genesis 5 is after Genesis 3. Adam is called in the likeness of God still, and so is Seth. So the image is not gone. The other argument I've made, and we'll get to this much, much later, is that the image of God is broken. There is not a single passage that says that. Every passage assumes the image is still fully intact. The purpose and dignity and purpose of humanity. So some people call it a functional, some people call it identity. I prefer to go with functional identity, trying to meet in the middle, understanding the relation aspect and the purpose aspect, because they're both deeply entwined, as we will see as we go further and further into the study over the next couple weeks. Every single passage assumes the image is still intact. And in fact, it is very important that we recognize that we have a preposition, but Christ has a definite article. But he is the image because he's human. I mean, you cannot be an image and not be physical. That is just grammatically, you can't have a square circle. You can't be an image without taking on physical something. It says in Philippians that Christ took on the likeness of humanity. So for likeness of for us is we have to elevate our standards to be more like him, but he lowered himself to be like us. And we're being conformed to his image, which is effectively saying that if he is the image and we're created to be in the image of God and he's coming down as the image, well, that means the standard is still there. The blueprint of humanity is still there. The intentionality and the relationship of humanity, the purpose of humanity, has not been lost. But the relationship was. That's why I like Carmen Imes' discussion of the estrangement of a child with their father. The rebellion caused a disconnecting from God, saying that we can seek wisdom in life from elsewhere, which is why Proverbs so frequently says, the way that seems right to man is the way that leads to death. And what do you see frequently through Genesis? People saying, oh, this looks good, I'm gonna take this. And it leads to either death or almost death. John Kilner, he said, he even admits it's not a perfect argument because you're talking about God, and it's not categorically the best, but at least gets the picture. A building has a blueprint to it. If the building cracks or crumbles, the blueprint didn't crack and crumble. The blueprint's still there. But it's the thing that is broken, not the intention. So humanity is broken. The image isn't. The purpose of humanity and the relation that we have to God, that we are his created images, in fact, it is the standard for morality, is the fact that there is image, entails that the image is not lost or broken, but humanity is almost, in some sense, estranging themselves and refusing to take on that function, to take on that purpose.